Oh yeah, you just hairy vetch and field pea. Sorry, I didn't see you have two there. Okay, very good. Okay, well, I guess I will get started then. If I can make my screen move here. Okay. Okay, so this is going to be a workshop on cover crops for gardens. I've actually done this in person twice with Josh and with the DPR. I'm Andy Clark. I am now retired from the USDA Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And I was based at the University of Maryland for about 33 years. I've been a community gardener since 1983. And around that time and just prior to that, I was a landscaper for a number of years before I went on to get my PhD in agronomy or agricultural science. And that really was a dissertation on cover crops. After that, I became the communications director for this USDA Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. As part of that, and one of the first things I did was edited actually what's been called the Cover Crop Bible, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. Several editions of that over the years. I'll show you some information from SARE.org, from the SARE website. And I am more accustomed to talking with scientists and farmers, so hopefully keep it where everyone can understand. So we've just asked if you cover crop and how long and what cover crops you're growing. I'm just going to check the chat again to see if we have anything else going on there. Okay. So I'm pretty sure that I will cover everything that you need to know with some of these questions along the way. So I'll just continue along now for now. I'm going to stop every few minutes. So if you have questions along the way, drop them back into the chat and I'll stop and look at those and see if I can answer them as we go along. And I don't know why this is taking its time advancing. Okay, so here's where I hope to go with this talk. Why should you plant cover crops? I'm going to go into the types of cover crops, or so make sure everyone's clear on those. Is it a winter, summer, a winter or summer? Is it a grass? Is it a legume? Is it something else? I'll talk about how to plant them, how to terminate them, details on what I would consider the best cover crops for this area. I'll give you some cover crop rotation scenarios. And along the way, we'll talk some soil biology, soil fertility. Not really deep into that, but you should know that planting cover crops really will improve your soil biology over time and even very quickly. So why do you plant cover crops? Here's a mostly hairy vetch cover crop with some rye in it, just to give you an example. So we do that to protect and improve the soil. Clearly, if it's pouring down rain onto this cover crop, you're protecting the soil. Anything growing on the soil, but especially if you would have nothing growing there, we're going to feed the soil biology. We will recycle nutrients. So you have to think that anything that you're growing is going to take nutrients from the soil and bring them essentially up to the soil surface. So you're recycling those rather than losing them. With legumes, we can fix nitrogen. We're going to grow our own mulch, and you can see we have quite a nice mat of material here that'll turn into a nice mulch. Almost always you're going to improve your soil water relations. The water is going to infiltrate better. It's not going to run off as it might, so you get better soil moisture, both when the cover crop is growing and after you've killed it. We can attract beneficial insects and suppress weeds. So those are at least a few of the benefits and the reasons why you want to grow cover crops. So just to reiterate, we can suppress weeds. Some cover crops will suppress diseases and nematodes, especially mustards. I'll talk about that briefly. If you have any kind of slope you're farming, then you can control erosion with those cover crops, increase the water infiltration. you stop nutrient loss. We're mostly interested in nitrogen and phosphorus, and in the Chesapeake Bay region, if those are available in your soil in the fall and nothing is growing for 5 or 6 months with rain and snow and freeze and thaw, you're going to lose almost all of the nitrogen and probably some of the phosphorus. That'll go into the Chesapeake Bay, which we want to try to avoid. We can attract beneficial insects. Some in particular that I'll mention alleviate soil compaction. We're adding organic matter, and organic matter is essentially our soil quality. Most of us aren't feeding livestock, except maybe the deer and rabbits and such. And then also we're adding nitrogen if you are planting a legume cover crop. We'll get into, I'll tell you about that. So here's an example on March 27th of a nicely cover cropped plot. Except in the one area where there is no cover crop, there we have some chickweed and henbit growing. So you can see how well that cover crop suppressed the weeds. And some people might say, oh, I got something, there's a cover growing there. Really good research has shown that those weeds are really not doing much of anything for you, for your soil. They might look like they have a lot of, there's really nothing being recycled there either. So we'll suppress weeds. We can also attract beneficial insects, and we can grow mulch. And you often see ladybugs in a rye or in a vetch rye cover crop mixture. And this is relatively early in the spring, before there's much else to attract or to house those beetles or other beneficials. This is, again, a hairy vetch cereal rye cover crop mixture. And this is really my main tool with my cover crop. So I'm going to use a hedge clipper to cut that down and then proceed with planting. I'll tell you more about that in a little while. So are there challenges with slugs? One of them, with cover cropping, one of them is slugs. And you will sometimes or even often have more slugs in a cover cropped area than not. And there are a number of things that you can do with that. My favorite is going with beer set out in little pie tins. And they apparently love beer and crawl into it and drown. Another one is the gritty material. And I was looking at this earlier, and actually kitty litter is a good way to deter slugs. Or there's an organic materials that is called Sluggo that you can use. Soil temperatures are probably colder in the early spring under a cover crop. So it mostly affects your early spring vegetables. And what I normally do is I would kill it a little bit earlier, let the soil warm up a little bit. You could see that this would warm up a little bit better than this cover crop. And then you're good to go with that. Is it more work? Probably. But here, Leanna and I, this is at the National Arboretum, about a 40-foot long plot. She and I knocked this out from looking like this to completely ready to plant in maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours. So, and if you do it a little bit at a time, so you're ready to plant your spring vegetables, you do a little bit of your plot, let the rest of it grow, and then continue on over the season, then it sort of becomes less and less feeling like it's a lot of work to get rid of all that cover crop, because you don't need to do it all at once. Leanna, by the way, is adding compost. So, and I'll talk more about how we actually do this in a couple of minutes. So what are your objectives for growing cover crops? For most of us as home gardeners, we want to add organic matter, that is, improve our soil. We want to feed the soil biology, again, improve our soil. You want to keep the soil covered over the winter. Some of the farmers are now talking about the soil is meant to be covered, and they're talking about a soil armor. So you, instead of having bare soil, which a lot of us would have over much of the winter in our community, in our gardens, we've got that covered. If you're planting a legume, then you'll be fixing nitrogen. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain it in a couple of minutes. And again, we're suppressing weeds. So better to have something that you want there to do something specific for you than whatever happens to come up in the weed seed bank. Cover crops also attract pollinators, and often there's food for pollinators earlier in the year when you have your cover crops growing, and similar with beneficial insects. Organic farmers have always said that a healthy soil is a healthy plant, and that gives you some insect and disease resistance just by being in good health. And again, we want to keep the nutrients in your garden rather than losing them to the Chesapeake Bay or any other nearby water source. So types of cover crops, we have grasses, legumes, brassicas, other broadleaf cover crops, including buckwheat, and phacelia is something that's being used as well. And I'll go into each of these in some detail. What is your cover crop growth habit? Is it a winter annual? And the winter annual is something that you plant in the fall and it lives throughout the winter. And I think that's the most common one and the one you're more likely to grow. Because otherwise your plot is bare all winter, and depending on how much space you have, you may not want to spare any of your land for cover crops during the summer, but you'll have that as well. So a summer annual, you can plant that for short periods between veggies or sort of at the end of the season, or for longer soil building. If you really feel like your soil is not doing it for you, you may commit some longer period of time to building your soil. These are less common perennial or biennial cover crops. You might have a living mulch. It is possible to grow something that stays there, maybe a clover or something, and you just leave it there and plant in between it, or you have something growing in your walkways. Or again, if you're really into long-term soil building, you might plant a perennial and leave it there for a year or two while it improves your soil, if you have that kind of space. Or maybe if you're just clearing new land for a garden, that might be something that you could do as well. So if you really don't want to sit here for very much longer, here's a spoiler alert. I would say plant a hairy vetch cereal rye mixture. It's really one of the best cover crops for our area for vegetable gardening. You would plant it in September or October, whenever your main veggie is done or harvested. As I mentioned before, turn it over section by section in the spring, a week or two before you're going to plant. So before you're going in to plant your lettuces and radishes and carrots, you might turn some under, leave the rest to grow. Then as you get into late April and you're starting to think about tomatoes and peppers, then you turn some more under. It's really good to plant as early as possible in the fall and kill it as late as possible in the spring. Especially the legumes continue to fix really a lot of nitrogen in the spring. In I'll say April mostly, is it just goes crazy, and you'll get 100 more pounds of fertilizer nitrogen. That would be per acre. You can also use crimson clover with the cereal rye, and in a way you could use a wheat or a barley as well. But the vetch rye is really the winner. And here's a vetch rye mixture on mid-April, 17th of April. You see just a little bit of weed off on the edge where we didn't have that planted, but otherwise, instead of weeds, you'll get your vetch rye mixture. Beautiful looking cover crop. Let me just check and see if there's anything else on the radish. How is radish categorized? Radish is a brassica, and I'll talk briefly about some of the brassicas along the way here. Any other questions? No, okay. All right. I really like the mixture, and I'm pretty sure I'll have another time to tell you this, but you get really the benefits of both the legume and the grass. Every once in a while, this doesn't feel like it wants to advance. I'm sorry. Okay, so small grain or a legume, or do you want them alone or in a mixture? And I've just said that I really prefer the mixture. Um, Here's an example where the photo on the left is mostly a rye. This is really a lot of rye early in March. And the photo on the right is mostly legumes. It's got field peas and crimson clover and hairy vetch in it. So what you need to think about when you're planting a pure rye is that it is likely to tie up nitrogen once you kill it or once you turn it into the soil. That's called immobilization. What's happening is the microbes in there, as they break down the carbon in this high carbon rye, use up any available nitrogen that's there. So you want to be really careful if what you've turned under or what you have is mostly a grass, that you watch your subsequent veggies and make sure they're not N deficient. This one, on the other hand, it's early. This plot of legumes will grow a lot in the next 4 to 6 weeks and provide, as I said, lots and lots of nitrogen, but it is unlikely at all to tie up your nitrogen. As soon as you kill it or turn it under, it will start releasing that nitrogen for your vegetable crop. So when you put them together, let's just go back here then. So your legumes are going to fix nitrogen, and then that is they add nitrogen that wasn't there before. They produce a little bit less mulch total. You can even see that in the difference right here. And they add less carbon. Remember, carbon is your soil quality, your soil organic matter. Non-legumes, grasses or brassicas or buckwheat, for example, they capture nitrogen that's there in your soil, and they do that over the winter so you don't lose it, but they don't add any additional nitrogen. They produce more mulch in general than a legume, and they add more carbon or more organic matter, add to your organic matter. And really the mixtures would do some of both, and they're pretty much intermediate in all of those. It kind of depends whether there's a lot of grass in that mixture or not very much legume in that mixture. That is actually a mixture. So this is a high carbon. It may tie up nitrogen. This is a high nitrogen, and it will not tie up nitrogen. Another spoiler alert, and then you can really leave. You can plant buckwheat in any 4 to 6 week period or longer, from April till September. So often if my lettuce is done and I'm not ready to put something else in, there's a good window for buckwheat. Again, just about any time you've got, think your soil will be empty, your plot will be empty for 4 to 6 weeks, you can put that in. It does wonders for what they call soil tilth, the feel of the soil. There's a phosphorus benefit in that it appears to make phosphorus more available, probably by dissolving the chemicals that phosphorus is in. It's not sure I can tell you exactly, but there seems to be a benefit, a phosphorus benefit. Buckwheat will attract pollinators, beneficial insects. It's really easy to turn under, to incorporate, or you can literally just pull it out of the ground in handfuls and get rid of it and plant after that. We've also seen that buckwheat, by attracting beneficial insects, will reduce pests and disease in other crops, in this case squash in Florida. So because whiteflies and aphids transmit viruses, when you have the buckwheat, it attracts beneficial insects. And then those insects act as natural enemies, and they get rid of the flies, the aphids, and thrips. So you're getting both beneficial insects and pollinators, as well as a pest and disease suppression in this particular case anyway. Here's an interesting thing. I had an area that didn't have any cover crop in it, a new area that I was planting. And I thought I was going to be putting tomatoes in there. So I planted buckwheat on April 5th, and it grew there for any number of times. I planted the tomatoes into it. I planted tomatoes around May 25th. And then right now, here the buckwheat is still growing on 6/27, and that's the day that I took my handy trimmers and cut most of that buckwheat down. So you've gotten that benefit of the buckwheat for 2.5 months. Hasn't affected the tomato growth. And you just had a cover crop rather than bare soil sitting there for that month and a half or so. Okay, so non-legume cover crops are your grasses, brassicas, mustards, buckwheat. Here again is the cereal rye. It'll reduce erosion, produce large amount of residue, add organic matter, suppress weeds, scavenge nutrients. So everything in that rye has come out of the soil. And again, if there was nitrogen there, it would be in the Chesapeake Bay by now if you hadn't planted that grass cover crop. Again, it might immobilize N. This is really, really a lot of grass. And if you took and turned that under, you're going to need to add some nitrogen fertilizer to that, or your next plants will suffer. Again, remember, we're not adding any N, we're just keeping N that was already there. And you should see, if you're interested, the soil fertility chapter in the Managing Cover Crops Profitably book. And I'm gonna find my way over to something there. So here are a couple of resources. This is the SARE Cover Crop Topic Room, and in particular, this one publication, Cover Crops for Sustainable Crop Rotations, is a pretty general overview, kind of the stuff that I'm telling you here. You can either download it as a PDF, or essentially the content on this page is that handout. It's a little 4-pager. I'll show you the PDF. So here's the cover crops for sustainable crop rotations. Here's a forage radish, which I'll talk about some more. And this is a researcher who's comparing the growth of rye versus the growth of this forage radish. And then it goes through a bunch of other stuff. The book, Managing Cover Crops Profitably, is, a 200-page book, and in it, it has a few pages about all of the primary cover crops that one might use, and then it has a lot of overview, general, really good information about what cover crops do. And that would be, for example, the soil fertility chapter there. It's really, I think it's really quite accessible and really great reading, let me tell you. Another one, and I'll just mention that now, is a book called Building Soils for Better Crops. That'll take you deep, deep, deep into lots of soil information, including how to read a soil test, for example, which is a pretty good, you get those and it's hard to figure out what those are, but there's some chapters on doing that. So see, again, in the soil fertility chapter, it has a lot about the nitrogen fertility, carbon nitrogen ratios, and some other stuff. Legume cover crops, really the ones we're going to grow are hairy vetch, field peas or Austrian winter pea, cowpeas, crimson clover are some of the common annuals. 3 of them are winter annuals, and the cowpea is a summer annual. There are some perennials. You might use red or white clover or medics or alfalfa. Again, if you want to have some growing for a little bit longer time. We don't really do biennials. They do in the Midwest a lot, where you plant a sweet clover one fall and leave it growing until the following summer or a little bit later. I won't talk any more about that at this point. But legumes are going to fix nitrogen. They will reduce erosion. They have produced less residue, and it lasts a shorter amount of time and less organic matter total. So you really want to know what your cover crops are and what you want to do with them. Are you doing a winter annual? Are you doing a summer annual? Are you doing perennials? And there's only one perennial here, red clover. And the rest of these are winter annuals: crimson clover, forage radish, oats, winter wheat, cereal rye, hairy vetch, and the Austrian winter pea. And these are These are most of your choices for annual cover crops. Are your cover crops winter hardy? In other words, a winter annual survives the winter. Um, Again, we have the red clover, crimson clover, hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea, or are they winter killed? Are they summer cover crops? And these will be killed by frost, soybean, sun hemp, I'll talk a little bit more about, a fava bean or a cowpea. Remember, these are legumes and they'll fix nitrogen. In our non-legumes, we have the summer non-legumes, sorghum, Sudan grass, oats. There's some millets that might be interesting. Radish is sort of fits in both. I've put it here too because some radishes will be killed by winter, and some of your mustards, again, actually these sometimes will survive the winter, radish and mustards. And again, none of these don't fix nitrogen. Then you have your cereal rye. Triticale is another one you might use. And annual ryegrass is more and more common. And you want to make sure that whether you're getting annual ryegrass or cereal rye. People sometimes call cereal rye annual rye, and they sometimes call rye ryegrass. So make sure you know what you're getting. And just as an example, if you probably know what pearled barley looks like, so your cereal rye would look like a barley or something like that, a fairly big seed. The annual ryegrass is a much tinier, skinny little seed. Sorry, I don't have, often I've had actually seed examples when I do this. Okay, so I'm gonna keep repeating this. I hope I'm not boring you too much, but remember what your grasses are gonna do. Not add nitrogen, they're gonna scavenge nitrogen, add organic matter, prevent erosion, also scavenge or hold phosphorus, get a long lasting residue, suppress weeds. They don't really release very much N over the next growing season. And some of them are deep rooted. And I really like this graphic here. And if you can think about at the end of your season or August or September and you're done planting and there's a bunch of nutrients there in the soil and you plant your cover crop. So the cover crop is going to take up the nutrients that are in there. A lot of it, most of it goes into the top growth. Some amount of it, 20 or more percent of it is actually in the roots. And then in the spring, you've kept all those nutrients right there in your garden, and whatever you do to kill them or turn them under, they're still there and ready for your next crop. And our best grass cover crops around here, mostly now talking winter annuals, would be cereal rye, or again called grain rye, wheat, barley, triticale. These are all called small grains in the agronomic world. Annual ryegrass is a great cover crop. It has a huge root mass. It's actually sometimes hard to kill or to turn it under. The roots are so thick, such a mass of roots, but it's a great cover crop, scavenging nutrients nearly as well as the cereal rye. And oats, if you plant spring oats in the fall, they will usually winter kill. And this might be an interesting one if you're not really feeling like you want to mess with all that residue in the spring. You get the cover crop benefit in the fall, and then in the spring it's dead and sometimes almost ready to plant. The best summer grass cover crops would be your sorghum Sudan grass, which can grow to 6 or 8 feet tall. It gives you lots and lots and lots of biomass, or straw. It will winter kill, at least with a hard frost. It's a really good one for breaking up compacted soil. So if you think you have bad compacted soil that water's not infiltrating into, it'd be a good one to grow for some period of time during the summer. Very deep rooted, and a similar but not nearly as much biomass would be millets. They are also less common around here. Yeah. So your winter annual legumes grow pretty slowly in the fall, and if it's just a legume, you don't have very much ground cover over the winter. They don't really take up a lot of nutrients in the fall. They might be fixing their own nitrogen. Most of what they're doing is in the spring. From around here, from say March 15th to May 15th, they are going to town, fixing atmospheric nitrogen. And so you want, if you can, to allow them to grow until late April or May, but whenever you're ready to get ready to plant, they're easy to cut and turn under. The residue breaks down pretty fast and it releases those nutrients to your veggies. They don't suppress weeds as well as a grass. And again, your hairy vetch, crimson clover, and Austrian winter pea would be your best bets for winter annuals in this area. The summer annuals will get you really a lot of biomass if you grow them for several months. They fix lots of nitrogen. They'll be killed by frost. They give you quite a bit of residue over the winter. Really good weed suppression while they're growing, and depending on how long you've grown them and how much residue, they might give you weed suppression over the winter. The residue breaks down some over the winter, so it's a little bit easier to manage the next year. And cowpeas, soybean, sun hemp, and fava are some of your main summer annual legumes. I'm going to ask Lou to tell me what she's doing with her, to say cowpea and buckwheat, and we'll talk about that. That's a nice little combination. This is a good time to be planting that. You have really a few months if you want to grow that. And then she said she's going to put the garlic into that. So that's a great thing to do. The garlic goes in a few months, and you've got that cover crop that's fixing some nitrogen, and with the buckwheat, improving the soil, making phosphorus more available, attracting beneficial insects, etc. So this is the forage radish. It was sometimes called a tillage radish because it's very deep rooted and it breaks up compaction. And I'll talk about that in a second. It usually winter kills, but there's been a year or two in the last 10 or 15 where it didn't completely winter kill here in the DC area. If it does, which again it usually does, the soil is just ready to plant right into in the spring. Nice to go and just drop some lettuce seeds right on top of that. But it does its best work if you get it planted by early September. Here's a photo of some hairy vetch, if you see it, and there's some forage radish in there. I actually planted this around a squash plant, which has now just been touched by frost a little bit. So while the squash was growing, I just had that growing alongside it. But the forage radish, or something, it is a daikon type radish, is really competitive. So in a mixture here, just 3 weeks later, you can almost see nothing but the radish. So it will outcompete and suppress anything else that's growing there, unless you really go low on the seeding rate, or if you're maybe seeding it in rows, seed it every other row or something like that. So that's forage radish with some other cover crops in it in the fall. There's some other brassicas, mustards, and one called Pacific Gold, they claim will suppress soil-borne pathogens, nematodes, fungi, and some weeds. That's because it releases glucosinolates. It's best if you actually chop up your mustard and incorporate it into the soil, and you may get these benefits. And they do scavenge nutrients that are already there. Rapeseed or canola is another brassica you can use, and turnips are a brassica. Turnip is not a bad way to go for a cover crop. It's a little bit like the forage radish. But you want to be careful that you don't grow too many brassicas, especially if you're growing kales or cabbages or other plants in the brassica family. So all of these are in the brassica family. So some winter killed cover crops, and this is possibly a nice thing to do if you're worried about the spring and taking care of that. You could plant spring oats and forage radish in the fall, and provided we get a couple days below 20, then in the spring that'll all be dead, started to break down, and much easier somewhat to manage in the spring. You might be able to take a hard rake and rake it out of the way, and then plant your plant your vegetable crop, and then move on. And then any summer annual that we've talked about will die with a hard frost. So those are winter killed or summer annual cover crops. So just because I'm just going to repeat this to you again, remember, are you planting something that's winter hardy? Is it a legume so you can fix nitrogen, or does it get killed by the summer crop? And again, your non-legumes that are winter annuals that will survive the winter, and those that will mostly not survive the winter. Okay, I'll look again for some questions. Here's a good photo of buckwheat on the left and sun hemp on the right. And I'll talk a little bit more about sun hemp. It's a legume. It really grows a lot. It fixes a lot of nitrogen. And as you know, the buckwheat hasn't fixed any nitrogen, but it has scavenged some. And this was last August. And I would guess that most of these have been in, the buckwheat was probably in about 6 or 7 weeks, and the sun hemp that much or a little bit longer. Sorry, I don't have the actual dates on that. So let's see if we have any more questions. You pulled garlic up and plant garlic again in the fall. All right, leave the cut buckwheat. Do you leave the cut buckwheat? Yes, you always, at least whenever you can, you leave your cover crop right there. That's the whole idea. You scavenge nutrients or you fix them. You leave them in place as a mulch, and as they break down over time, they release those nutrients, and they act as a mulch where they will help suppress weeds. Oh, the earthworms love this stuff. They're just they're great. So I do not like to see any bare soil anywhere on my plot, and I'm constantly cutting, taking, moving plant residue onto the plot. Let's see. Okay, is the timing of turning cover crops when they begin to flower crucial, or can the flowers be there a while? So buckwheat in particular actually will reseed itself if I don't mind a few buckwheat plants coming up somewhere, but you might if you let this go much longer where the seeds start to turn brown. I don't see any here. Then that will reseed itself, and maybe in a big way. As for your winter annuals, it's great to leave the crimson clover growing. It's beautiful. It might reseed itself, but if it does, it'll be the following fall, which shouldn't be a problem. So I usually let those flower if I have time, crimson clover or hairy vetch. I hope that answered the question. And I think I have a great picture of crimson clover, unless I already showed it. So here's an example in September where we've taken that sun hemp and we've just used it to lay it around Swiss chard. So it's going to break down over the next couple of months, release some of that nitrogen, and it's mulching the plot there. So if it rains hard, the soil, the water, more of it will infiltrate. We won't erode the soil. We won't have any problems, and we're probably suppressing some weeds this way as well. So talk a little bit about carbon. Carbon is really the building block of soil. So soil organic matter is essentially your carbon. The photo on the left here, I mean, if you compare these two soils, you can hopefully just tell that one of them on the left is really pretty bad shaped soil, and here is what the soil looks like, just turned over, you know, with a cover crop in the spring. So grasses, again, add a lot of carbon. Legumes might add a little bit, but not really as much because they're higher in nitrogen than carbon. So too much carbon will tie up your nitrogen, as I've mentioned. So if you really have mostly grass, you want to be careful and think about adding fertilizer nitrogen. like compost, you really need browns and greens to feed the soil biology. They want carbon, they need the carbon for energy, they need the nitrogen to put together their proteins. And so they use both to break down your residue. Remember, grasses are very high in carbon, especially if they're very mature, and legumes are high in nitrogen. And the mixtures are intermediate. And again, when you can, I would recommend that you just plant mixtures. Once again, a high carbon, even though this is lush green rye early in the year, I can predict almost with 100% certainty that this carbon nitrogen ratio is high enough that it would tie up nitrogen once you turn it into the soil. And I can also tell you that this mixture here with mostly legumes will not tie up your nitrogen. Okay, this is a complicated slide, but let's see if we can go through it. Let's start with the plants. So let's say we have a cover crop and we're planting a cover crop. That cover crop is going to take up the nitrate and a little bit of ammonium that's in the soil. So it's taking that nitrogen up into the plant biomass. And if we didn't do that, it would be leaching or denitrifying over the winter. So again, almost any nitrogen that's left in the fall in this area will be gone if there's nothing growing there on the soil. So we take it up into the plant and all other nutrients too as well, of course. And then the soil, and when we kill that plant or turn it under or cut it, then the soil microbes start breaking it down and it gets tied up in the soil microbial biomass. So if there's too much carbon, then all of the nitrogen and the carbon goes into that microbial biomass. And then that essentially becomes soil organic matter. And there's a whole soil food web going on there. If we have a legume growing, then we take nitrogen gas, which is not available to plants, and that goes into the plant, and then we go back into, and it goes into the soil organic matter. Then that slowly breaks down over time and releases to usually first ammonium and then through some other processes, nitrate. So again, ammonium and nitrate are what the plant will take up as their fertilizer, as you wish, as the nitrogen fertilizer. If we're adding fertilizer, that's taking N2 gas and using a really lot of energy, high heat and high pressure to produce nitrogen fertilizer. So another good reason for growing your own N is that you're not using all of that energy to make it. And why not have your plants do it if they'll do that? I'll just say one other thing again. So all these nutrients in the fall, some of them actually go directly into the biomass. If they're using nitrogen to break down the plants, then you lose that. And that's called immobilization, where either ammonium or nitrate is used to essentially by the microbes. You can also have nitrogen fertilizer volatilize or go off as a gas, or denitrify if it's very flooded, very wet. So if we look again at these grasses, you have all those nutrients in the soil. We plant our plant. They take those nutrients out and it's all up in the biomass here. They get slowly broken down by the soil microbes and released, mineralized back into the soil, whereas in this case, say your vegetable is ready to take it up. And also it's a slow release fertilizer, so there's not too much at any one time. And so there's less risk that you'll leach it, more risk of leaching if you put all of your fertilizer down on top of your tomatoes in May and it starts raining like some of the rains we see around here these days. I'll stop again for questions. This is Dr. Ray Weil at the University of Maryland. He's dug a soil pit here. This is the forage radish. And some of the research that he's done, even though you say, wow, look at that big root, the research that he's done shows those radish roots going down, down. I think he was showing some down here to maybe 30 inches is what he said. So that while this is growing over the fall and into the early winter, it's taking all that nitrate, nitrogen, and bringing it up to the top of the soil and into the plant and into this tuber. And then it's ready to start being released to the plants the following year. Yes, let me look and see if there are more questions. Let's see. Oh, so why is vetch your best cover crop? Vetch fixes more nitrogen than any other of those legumes. Not a whole lot more, but definitely more than the crimson clover does. And crimson clover, if you let it go long enough, actually gets a little bit stemmy and doesn't break down as fast. And then when you plant the vetch and the rye together, the vetch just climbs up into the rye. And so there's better use overall of your sunlight and your nutrients, and then kind of easier to kill. So number one, it fixes more nitrogen than the others. And the other one is that it breaks down a little bit faster, and it really pairs well with a grain crop. And I see something that says sunflowers, but I don't know what, are you asking, can sunflowers be used as a cover crop? They certainly can be used as something growing. Yes, sunflowers are not generally used as a cover crop. I would say, one, they're not fixing any nitrogen. They don't really cover the soil very well. They kind of grow tall. They grow stemmy. Certainly, if you want to grow some sunflowers, both for the look of them and everything, they're there in your plot, but they're not used very often as a cover crop. Oops, you never seem to want to go after that. Okay, a little bit about how you plant cover crops. First would be how you would broadcast them after harvest of your vegetables. If there are any weeds or crop residue left there, you can turn them under a little bit, or you can just cultivate the top few inches. Maybe you add compost then if you have it. It's not a bad time to add compost. You broadcast your seed. I'll talk about seeding rates later. Incorporate it lightly, usually no more than 1 to 2 inches. Tamp it down a little bit, mulch it lightly, and water it, and keep an eye on it, and it should grow just fine. You can also plant your cover crops under growing plants, and this is something, you know, you're late September, October, you're still holding out on that tomato plant that's mostly done, but it looks like it's still giving you a few little cherry tomatoes every once in a while, or your squashes, as I showed, or peppers. You don't really want to take them out yet, but it's getting into cover crop time. So you can really just scratch the soil underneath those plants. Remember, there are growing roots under there, but scratch it lightly. Maybe add compost at this time. Mound the soil up around the base of the plant, or some such, just to protect it. You broadcast your cover crop seed. Again, scratch it in a little bit, or maybe you just throw some other soil on top of it, so you're not digging into the current soil. Tamp it down a little bit and water it, and then you really can get cover crop, as I showed in an earlier slide, growing at the same time as you have whatever other squash, pepper, late, something that's going late into the fall. So I'll use that often that way. I am not going to show these videos now, but there are two, and there's a resource list. We might do it at the end, but I don't think I'll do it now. There's a resource list that lists these two YouTube. One of them, I was seeding it here into a new area. And here Dr. Brennan is in California showing you, he's got some really good information in that one as well. You need to plant your cover crops early, and this slide shows the difference in the amount of growth that you had on April 1 when you planted at different days. And you can see that this, you know, the later you go, the less and less cover crop growth that you have. This is from, I believe, Indiana. I would probably, around here, this is probably more like September 15th to November 15th or something. The kind of growth you might get the later you plant. So You want to plant your cover crops as early as possible. See, now this going into the winter hasn't really recycled very much nutrients. It really doesn't have much growth. It's really not, it's not covering the soil very well all winter long until April 1, compared to something here where you got it planted on time or early. So we want to get our we want to get our cover crops planted by mid-October. Earlier is better. We can go a little bit later, as I'll show you in a minute. Seeding rates on these, and I say, see the MCCP charts. There are charts in the Managing Cover Crops Profitably book that tells you a lot about the cover crops, how to plant them, and also the seeding rates, and that's where this information comes from. So let's say you have a 10 by 20 area, that's 200 square feet. This would be the rate per 100 square feet, and it's in ounces for your small grains, your buckwheat, your hairy vetch, and most of the clovers. And again, especially the forage radish, you want to go much lower. They're tiny, tiny seeds for one, so you get many, many more plants. And then if you're planting a mixture, then you would just divide by the number of species. So let's say you're planting rye and hairy vetch. I would go 2 to 3 pounds of, let's see, in 100 square feet, just to keep it simple, 2 to 3 ounces of the rye and 1 to 2 ounces of the hairy vetch. And if you add another one in there, let's say you do hairy vetch and crimson clover, then that's 3 species. Then you want to go down to 1 to 1.5 ounces and do the math that way. Okay, so how do we terminate cover crops? This is what my favorite method is. I've got cover crops growing everywhere. I'm going to clip them with my handy dandy clippers to about 4 inches. If you're having trouble getting that cover crop completely turned under, then clip it a little bit shorter. It becomes easier. But so clip it to 3 to 4 inches. You rake that residue, a lot of it, off to the side. It's okay to leave some of it there. Good time to add compost or fertilizer if you're doing that. Turn it under completely with a shovel. Sometimes you might add little compost so you have that on top. Smooth out the seed bed, plant your seeds or your transplants, and then take some of that residue and cover that soil. So this slide on April 28th, I would say that this area was planted to lettuces and such a few weeks ago. This area, I've just cut down this cover crop, raked it aside, turned it over. And since it's early and my tomatoes or peppers aren't going in for another month, I'm going to keep more of that growing for a bit longer so we can get more residue and more fixed N. Again, here's Leanna and I working this plot. We took this waist high or thigh high cover crop, cut it down, and you can see where it's been cut to a few inches. This is compost that Leanna's adding. With a shovel, again, you want to see if you can get all of that green material turned under. It may regrow if you don't, and it just gets in the way if you don't. And here's how I normally do it: is I start in one corner and work backwards. And you'll just have to try it to see how that works for you. But what happens is you turn this one, and maybe there's a little bit of this residue sitting here, but when you take the next one and lift it up, the residue disappears and you drop this on top of it. Oh, I didn't mean to show you that, but that's beautiful. So again, a little bit at a time over spring, you cut down your section by section, turn it under, etc. And again, you know, look at what this looks like. It's just beautiful, beautiful soil. There may be some nitrogen nodules in here, but anyway, there's what this will look like. And the birds like it too. And there are lots and lots of worms when you have cover crops growing. Another method that I use a lot is to do no-till transplants, where you have your cover crop growing, you decide where you're going to plant your tomatoes or peppers or whatever. You clip that area to that same 4 to 6 inches just make one hole for your transplant, add compost if you want, put the transplants in, and then leave that other stuff there growing for a while. You can let it grow and clip it a little bit occasionally. So you keep fixing in, you keep suppressing weeds all around your plant, your tomato or pepper, and they're not interfering with the vegetable as long as you have enough water, which is usually not a problem in the spring anyway. Here's a close-up of that, and I don't know how well you can see, but here we have tomatoes growing already planted inside this. You can barely tell, and all of the residue around, and some of it probably will still keep growing. We'll stop again for questions. So here's a sorghum Sudan grass, and it's very, very deep rooted, and it will break up compacted soil. Usually if you have compaction, it's going to be at 6 or 8 inches, maybe everywhere where you've been digging every year to a shovel's depth. So sorghum Sudan grass is great at breaking through that. This is a cowpea. You can see not quite so much of a root mass there, but nice top growth, fixing nitrogen. Let me see. How short should stems be cut? So again, I cut them to about 4 inches. See, if you haven't done it a lot, you might want to cut it a little shorter. It's easier to turn under when it's shorter. You can leave the full length of the stem and you have straw of what you've cut and set it aside. The other thing you can do is clip it a little bit more, cut it into smaller pieces. Again, you don't want too much that you can't turn under, but you can cut it into smaller pieces, leave it there, and then turn more of it under, just to the point where, again, where you can be pretty sure that you've buried all of that residue, and then it'll start breaking down in the soil. And then you take what's left and use that. Always you're keeping that. Remember, you're growing that cover crop. You're growing and saving nutrients, and you want to put them right back onto your garden all the time. Okay. I think we're coming down here a little bit. Oops, you don't like that. So here are some various scenarios of cover cropping. If it's August, you can do buckwheat, forage radish, phacelia. Sometimes you can even do buckwheat now and then do another fall crop and do a fall crop in September, October, or plant another cover crop. We want our forage radish to be planted early, and even late August is not too early. If you have a blank area in your plot, and it, as I said, usually will winter kill. Oops. More of these summer annuals will winter kill, and the earlier you plant them, the more biomass you can get from them. But August is a time, or a little bit earlier on some of these, will give you nice biomass. You can plant summer annuals with winter annuals. So one thing you could do is plant a buckwheat with something else like the forage radish, or with a hairy vetch or something. I wouldn't do that hairy vetch before August, but mix them, and then the summer annuals will die and the winter annuals will keep growing over the winter. When you get to September, October, you want your winter annuals, either alone or in mixtures, as I say, which is the best. Rye or ryegrass, wheat, barley, hairy vetch, crimson clover, winter pea. Austrian winter pea is what that's usually called. And again, if you want to have it all winter kill, then you could just plant a forage radish and the spring oat. And it's an interesting thing to try. And you should experiment. There's so many cool things you can do. If you get into November or maybe even December, you shouldn't plant anything except cereal rye. The legumes, none of the other stuff will grow. You'd be wasting your money, or barely grow. You'd be wasting your money to plant anything but cereal rye. And then you'll get some cover, sort of like the slide I showed where you planted very late. Some, in my mind, is still better than none at all. In the spring, we don't usually plant cover crops in our vegetable gardens in the spring, but you can do that in late February or March, you can plant a field pea, a Austrian winter pea, or I've even done a cover crop mix. You can get a sort of a fall cover crop mix, fall manure, green manure mix, but I've planted them early spring and gotten good results. By April, or usually a little bit later, but it seems to work April as I've done, you plant buckwheat if you're not ready for anything else. And then again, all through May, all the rest of the summer, you can plant any of these summer annual cover crops. Then again, all summer long, any window, anytime you have bare ground, I like buckwheat. After lettuce, after some green beans, before fall crops. And then again, you can plant some of these others anytime May to August. And while they're growing, any of those, you can clip them and lay them over and mulch your other plants. So the sun hemp, as I showed, you cut some of that, put it over and use it as a mulch and a slow release fertilizer for any of your other veggies still growing. Here's a shot of buckwheat that was planted on the 2nd of August, and a week later, this is what it looks like. So it germinates fast, and it'll cover the ground pretty fast. And then here's buckwheat. This is actually the same day, some buckwheat that was planted some weeks earlier. Again, it's flowering, but it probably hasn't started to go to seed. So this is might be 5 or 6 weeks old. And as I said, if you let it get much more mature than this, you start producing seed and it will germinate sometime later in your plot. And for some people that becomes a weed problem. So you just want to be aware of that and watch out for it. This is a sorghum Sudan grass. It was planted, sorry, I don't know exactly, late June, and this is what it looks like in early August. So that's really, really a lot of grass growth there. I do want to watch this little video. I hope that I'm going to check the chat in a minute. Someone tell me if you're not. Oh, you know what? I'm going to watch it on here. Someone tell me on the chat if you're not hearing this, and I'll check that.
Grassland, Oregon, home of novel solutions for growing concerns.
Okay, I'm going to pause. Could you hear that? Could you hear the, oops, come on. Yes, okay. So we'll go back to watching that video. Hopefully I'm not getting a bandwidth issue here.
Grassland, Oregon, home of novel solutions for growing concerns, we get a lot of calls and questions about the great things our seeds can do. Lately, there has been a lot of interest in how some of our clovers, like Fixation Balanza, Frosty Berseem, or Kentucky Pride Crimson, can reduce or even eliminate commercial fertilizer costs through nitrogen fixation in the soil. So, how do plants fix nitrogen in the soil? For thousands of years, farmers have known that legume plants, like clover, would promote the growth of plants growing after them. Growing legumes like clover in a field would result in the next year's crop of non-legume plants, such as corn, cotton, or wheat, producing a more bountiful harvest. This led to the practice of crop rotation, which can be traced back to techniques recorded in Roman literature. People knew legumes replenish nutrients like nitrogen in the soil, but didn't know exactly how the process worked until the late 1880s. Hermann Hellriegel, a German agricultural chemist, discovered that leguminous plants took atmospheric nitrogen and turned it into fertilizer or ammonium in the soil through the process now known as nitrogen fixation. He found that the nodules on the roots of legumes are the location where nitrogen fixation takes place. Martinus Willem Beierjank, a Dutch microbiologist and botanist, discovered that the root nodules contained microbes. He further demonstrated that these microbes were bacteria, which he named rhizobia. These rhizobia are absolutely critical in the process of nitrogen fixation. Our clover seeds are inoculated or covered with rhizobia to make sure the right balance exists for this ecological process to work at peak efficiency, so it can fix as much natural nitrogen as possible. How much nitrogen is fixed, and when is this valuable resource available for use, you ask? Studies as early as 1908 have shown that legumes, such as clovers, can fix as much as 360 pounds of nitrogen per acre in 1 year. That's a lot of natural fertilizer. During their life cycle, our clovers act like nitrogen factories, utilizing and storing almost all of the nitrogen they produce. It's only after the plant dies and decomposes that the bacteria release the nitrogen and make generous amounts of valuable biofertilizer available in the soil for other plants. So now you know how plants fix nitrogen. Won't you help your friends get smarter by sharing this information? Or even better, by sharing this little PSA. Thank you.
So 360 pounds is more than your winter annuals will produce. You can get 200 or 250 pounds in a hairy vetch. A crimson clover is more like 150 to 175. This is per acre. Sorry, I can't easily translate that to other. But again, the idea that those nodules are breaking down that nitrogen gas, putting it into the plant. A lot of people say they're putting it into the soil, but ultimately that nitrogen is going into the plant. In the symbiosis, the plant is feeding those bacteria nutrients, and so it is a symbiotic relationship. And then it's when the plant starts breaking down, is killed or done, that the nitrogen is released mostly from in the plant tops and the roots, not sort of just in the soil. So you do want to inoculate your legumes, especially if you've never grown them before in your particular area. You need to add those bacteria called rhizobia, and you buy that inoculant with the seed. And that picture of them covering that seed with that black powder, there are millions and millions of bacteria in a teaspoon of that powder. So you put a little of that powder, and they're specific. So if you're growing peas or vetch, you get the pea vetch one. The clover, sometimes they'll come inoculated, as that video showed, so then you don't need to buy it separately. If you have to inoculate, you need to wet the seed just a little bit, add that inoculant, stir it up, shake it up, and you can either plant it right away, but if you don't, you should make sure it gets dry so it doesn't rot if you're not going to plant right away. So that's inoculating legumes. It's definitely worth the investment of a couple dollars. After you've been growing any of these, if you've grown peas and vetch and clovers and inoculated them and had them there a year or two, then you don't really need to inoculate anymore. Those bacteria stay on in the soil. So soil health is our microbes. We have fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. The fungi, this is the soil food web. There's just all kinds of things going on in the soil if you are continuing to feed it. If you don't have anything growing for a number of months, then all of this slows down or practically stops until you get more things growing. So you have fungi that feed on dead organic matter. They attack microbes. They also form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots that helps the roots take up nutrients. That's called a mycorrhiza. And they add to the soil particle stickiness. The bacteria are there, they're feeding on organic matter, storing and cycling nitrogen, decomposing pesticides, and among other things. And then the invertebrates, these are your worms and beetles and other little things, shred up the organic matter, they cycle the nitrogen, they create pores in the soil, and again, add to the stickiness that makes for a good soil. Here's just an example after a summer storm of what happens if you really do not have good infiltration. People walking on their soil when it's wet, any kind of thing. On the same day, and happens to be my particular plot, no such flooding. So Over the time, as you're growing your cover crops, they're improving the soil, the infiltration, more pore space. And of course, if you have plenty of residue everywhere, then that helps with your infiltration. And, you know, a short summer storm, you want as much of that water as you can get to stay on your plot. And you never want to see anything like that. Just another quick review. Remember, you want to be thinking, are you planting a winter versus a summer cover crop? Is it a legume or not legume? And the differences in what those will do for you, annual, biennial, or perennial. Will they winter kill or are they winter hardy? Intercropping, you can keep cover crops growing around other crops if you want, if you're careful and don't let them outcompete. And I'll repeat that mixtures of grasses and legumes are really, really great. This is an interesting little experiment, as it were, at the National Arboretum with different cover crop mixes that one of these companies was selling. So there's a forage radish in a lot of them. This is probably a pure radish. And these are mixtures of radish. I'm pretty sure this is ryegrass and radish. There's some pure legumes. So the legumes don't grow very fast. I think this is a crimson clover. And then there are mixtures of legumes and grasses where you get a little better total soil cover. So when you put both the grass and the legume or the radish together, you really get the best of both worlds. I should have put the link for this, but you can find this on NRCS if you want. Remember, we have cool season plants, warm season plants. We have grasses. We have other broadleaf plants, and all of these are other broadleaf plants. Most of them could be used as cover crops if you want. They do say here's a sunflower there as one. You know, are they legumes or are they not legumes? So that's another way of looking at that. Winter kill here, WK here means they will kill in the winter. So warm season plants are winter killed. A couple of others are winter killed. And again, some radishes and turnips will winter kill, and some of the other mustards may not winter kill. And I think that's all I have. So I go back to see if there are any questions. If you know, I could probably, yes, so yes, you should inoculate. Do you have to inoculate the seeds? Yes, I will say inoculate legumes. And it is necessary. If you don't have those rhizobia there in the soil, then the legume actually will not fix nitrogen because it's not the plant that's fixing it. It's that rhizobia bacteria that fixes nitrogen. So it's, again, a good insurance policy. And when you inoculate those, as soon as that root starts coming out, it has to come out right through that layer of bacteria. So it also infects, they call it infecting, you know, immediately. So it immediately gets ready, gets set to start fixing nitrogen. Whereas if it's somewhere out there in the soil and not very many, then it won't inoculate, it won't, you know, start fixing nitrogen quite as well or as efficiently. And if it's the wrong kind of bacteria, rhizobia there, you might still get infection, but it won't fix nitrogen as efficiently either. Let's see. I'm about done with that. I don't like watching myself on a video, so if you want to, you can watch. I'll see if we have, let's see what I'm looking for here. Oops, let me see. I sent to Josh this list of some resources. So those videos are on there. I think he's going to post them somewhere, as well as he'll post the PowerPoint if you want to go back and read it. And actually, I'm always available I'm going to put this in the chat, I guess. I'm always available if you want to email me something. So I'm going to put my email address in here, if it'll let me. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay, andy.sand.clark@gmail.com. Let's see. Okay, so, oh yeah, that's right, Megan, you were having trouble with weeds and with different cover crops and not getting enough coverage, not broadcasting correctly. If you're planting your cover crop and let's see, you were doing hairy vetch and peas or something like that. If you're planting them by mid-October, and watering them or tamping, getting them in well, then they should do well enough if you're planting a high enough seeding rate. If you have a really bad weed problem, I'm trying to think what weeds you would have in the fall. Are you ending up with probably with chickweed and henbit kind of weeds over the winter and they outcompete the, yeah, so if you're really having a lot, some creep and charge, so grass, right? So if, some of those you may have to work harder on getting rid of beforehand, maybe with growing a summer cover crop right before that. Plant a mixture, plant a grass and a legume so your rye will compete with that other grass better. Make sure you get that weedy stuff killed before you plant into it. That's about the best I can say on that. Keep trying and try some other cover crops. Again, a mixture with a grass in there would probably help a lot. If no one else has anything, then thank you for showing up for this. Let me know if I can help you with anything. And you should be able to find those resources on the website. How do I get out? Okay, I'm closing out somehow. Yep, stop share. Okay, thanks. Oh, hi, Julie. Goodbye.